Hello everyone! Coach Ervin and Coach Brian here of 9.09er. For this particular video, we're going to talk about the most common topics in IELTS speaking. That's because we checked. We have 90 to 100 videos on YouTube already. It's just that we have some videos showing you sample responses in IELTS speaking, like the on-the-spot speaking that Sir Philip did. But wait a minute. If we have another video talking about the tips on getting 9 in IELTS speaking, then why not focus on the most common topics? First things first, let's talk about the 3 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. So, Sir Brian, will you please share to our viewers and subscribers what's Part 1 in IELTS speaking?
Part 1 is your introduction. This is an interview in which you're going to be asked questions that are mainly about yourself. So these are very preferential questions, like what you like, what you don't like, what your habits are, what are your favorite items, or what's your favorite color perhaps. These are the kinds of questions that come out in the first part of your examination. You don't really have to think too much in this part of the test because they're all about you, unless you don't know yourself.
Consider this as a warm-up. So, when you perform an exercise, you don't go to the difficult part right away, right? That's why, for IELTS Task 1, IELTS examiners would usually ask you questions related to what is your favorite food? Or tell me something about your childhood pet. These are questions that don't require you to think for like 20 seconds or 30 seconds before you come up with a response. It's just that we noticed a pattern. So how do we know that there is a pattern in IELTS speaking? That's because both of us took the examination twice. In my case, I took one IELTS academic and one IELTS general training, but both of them are IELTS on paper. Well, that's because I'm not technologically savvy and, well, I'm a bit frightened by the QWERTY keyboard. I prefer to write on paper. But Sir Brian right here took 2 IELTS, 1 IELTS on paper and 1 IELTS on computer. And he took 1 academic module and 1 general training module. So we've noticed in speaking, part 1, there are usually 3 tasks, 3 topics, and 3 questions each. So that means to say, in 5 minutes, expect a total of 9 questions. So do the mathematics. 5 minutes, 9 questions. It's not as if you can talk forever.
Yeah.
The examiner won't allow you to finish your responses. So it's perfectly normal if the examiner is going to interrupt or interfere while you are talking. So would you still remember, Sir Brian, what were the 3 topics that came out in your task 1?
The examiner asked me about what I do, my work. The examiner asked me about the transportation modes I take to and from my workplace. And third, the examiner asked me whether I like drinking coffee.
So if you notice, it's not rocket science, right? Those are simple questions because like what we've said, part 1 is warm up. I vividly remember what came out in my first task. House, food, art. So for house, I was tasked to describe my house. And follow-up question related to house, tell me something about your dream house. Then, food. What's my favorite food? Do you know how to cook? Given the chance, which kind of food would you like to learn how to cook? Talk about your favorite foreign cuisine, or talk about a foreign cuisine that you'd like to try but you've never had the opportunity to try in the past. Now, the third one sounds a bit scary, like art, but it's not as if the examiner is going to intimidate you or overwhelm you in the beginning. So what specifically did my examiner ask related to art? As simple as, do you like art? Which kind of art would you like to try in the future?
Okay.
Painting,
All right.
sculpture, something like that.
Okay.
So when the examiner feels that you're pumped up already, that's when you move to part 2. So, Sir Brian, what is IELTS speaking task 2?
In the second part of the examination, you're going to be given 3 things: a piece of paper, a pencil, and a task card that contains the main topic and some sub-questions or some bullet questions that you need to respond to during your 2-minute speaking time. You will be given 1 minute to prepare what you're going to say, and you will have to talk for 2 minutes in the test.
So remember, this is what we call individual long term. This means to say, if in task one, the examiner is going to interrupt, is going to butt in while you're talking, in task two, you're basically on your own, uninterrupted. So, 1 minute to prepare, you can use your outline as your guide while you're talking later on. For the actual speech or the actual delivery, 1 to 2 minutes. If you don't reach 1 minute, expect a penalty. So, what's the goal of all the candidates? To reach the second minute. So, in my case, what came out in my IELTS speaking task 2, remember I took the test twice. In one attempt, I was asked to talk about a museum that I have visited when I was younger. And then the second one, a musical instrument that I want to learn how to play, well, in the future. So, Sir Brian, can you still recall the question that came out in your IELTS speaking task 2?
Certainly, my first IELTS, I received a question about a book that I read as a child. And when I took my examination for the second time, the question was about an item that I lost, but I was eventually able to find.
We've noticed that in IELTS Task 2, you are given the golden opportunity to make long responses. That's why you're going to tell stories in Speaking Task 2. Most likely, IELTS Speaking Task 2 is going to ask you to talk about your experiences. And remember, if it's an experience, you usually provide a lot of details. Now, what did we notice are the common topics in IELTS Part 2? Events, okay? An instance when you came in late, the event that made you happy, a party that you'd like to organize for someone. It's expected that you deliver long responses here because you're going to recollect experiences. If you look at the task card, there are 3 bullet points. Obviously, you have to discuss all of them. But in the event that you've already answered all 3 of them, but you haven't reached the finish line yet, what do? Ask yourself the 5 W's and 1 H to deliver a longer response to help you reach the second minute. What are the 5 W's and 1 H? Who, when, where, why, what, and how? If we're going to apply these questions to the topic that I encountered when I took the test, museum, right? So, what's the museum? Number 2, when did you visit that museum? Where is it located? Why that museum and not the other museums? Why? Who were you with when you visited that museum? How was your experience? So, what about you, Sir Brian? Can you please apply the 5 W's and 1 H to one of the two topics that came out?
So when, probably the first time I read the book, what the title of the book was, where I read the book perhaps, or what library I got the book from, or where I purchased the book. Why did I read the book in the first place? And how did I go about reading the book? What was the process that was involved? How many days perhaps did I spend working on it?
So that's IELTS Task 2 in speaking. Let's move on to Task 3. We call this two-way discussion, which lasts for about 4 to 5 minutes. In other words, we call this the follow-up round. Based on our experience, most examiners here would usually ask 3 follow-up questions. But if your responses are very short, that's when you'll be asked more questions, like up to 5 follow-up questions. You don't want more questions? Then we suggest deliver long responses. Our suggestion, don't stop talking unless the next question is asked. Because for us, it's much easier to make one answer longer than to think of a new response every single time.
That's correct.
So, talking about my task 2, I was asked questions related to museum and art. So, what were the follow-up questions? Because we've been teaching IELTS for the last 16 years already, we've noticed a pattern in speaking task 3 as well. And what are the most common? Number 1, past and present. So, for my specific topic, museum, I was asked, compare and contrast the museums before and the museum now. What about future? So, I was also asked by my examiner, how do you think museums are going to evolve in the future? So don't forget, while you're preparing for the examination, perhaps it might be helpful if you start to think, what about art? If that's the topic that came out in your task 2, prepare for your task 3 as early as now, right? Okay, so how can we compare art then and art now? Or how do you think it's going to evolve in the future? What about you, Sir Brian? Have you noticed other common topics or common questions in task 3?
Well, this is the part of the examination when the examiner wants to really stretch and really try to challenge your brain. And in my examination, in which I got a 9.0 in the speaking examination, the questions were significantly harder than my first try. And they were about, guess what, guys? Mostly artifacts and relics. And I was like, oh my goodness, what is this? Because my question was about an item that I lost that I was eventually able to find. Most of the questions were about art galleries, about museums, about artifacts and relics. And that's a little bit challenging. Don't be scared if the questions are getting tougher and tougher. It means the examiner is acknowledging your abilities.
Some of our reviewees ask us, what if the examiner argues with you? That's not an indicator that you're going to fail in the examination. Why? Because there is no moral judgment whatsoever of your answer. The examiner is there to assess your English proficiency level. However, I'd like to share something that I've learned because in the last 16 years of teaching IELTS, I have personally met IELTS experts who told me that if they ask you basic questions, that means to say they feel that your mental faculties are not that superior. So what's the point of arguing with someone, right?
Yeah.
But if the examiner feels you have what it takes to get the highest possible grade in the examination, they push you to your limits. And what do? Try to ask more complicated questions just to check if you can carry out with the argumentation. So it's more of a privilege if the examiner asks you more complicated topics or questions in task 3. So task 1 is quite similar to task 3 because for task 3, there is no preparation time. You respond right after you are asked. So Sir Brian right here got a 9 in speaking. I also got a 9 in speaking. We've shared with you what we did in order to conquer this subtest, which is quite daunting for most of the candidates. Now, Sir Brian, would you like to say some final words regarding our main topic or main subject, which is the most common questions in IELTS speaking?
Sure. You guys need to research a lot, and probably you would really need to review some of the questions that have come out before because chances are they're going to be recycled, and one of those will be your actual question in the test. Here at 9.09er, we have tons of questions that we have collated over the years that you can utilize so that you can prepare better for your English examination, particularly the IELTS.
But sometimes it's not enough that you know the common topics. Even if you prepare for these topics, but there is no one to tell you if your responses are good enough, then you might be roaming in the dark, especially because there is no feedback. That's why we provide daily one-on-one coaching to our reviewees. So know the questions, prepare for the questions beforehand, and don't forget to ask for an honest evaluation before you register for the test. So once again, this is Coach Ervin and Coach Brian of 9.09er. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure to click the subscribe button. Bye.
Bye, guys.